Welcome to this presentation. Today, we are going to talk about the LiDAR areas of interest in Venezuela and the Venezuelan-Colombian border. First, Jose Oliver is going to talk about the general introduction and the Falcón state. Then, I will talk about the Western Venezuelan Llanos, and finally, Natalia Lozada is going to talk about the Tomo region and at the Venezuelan and Colombian border. Thank you very much for being here. Jose, whenever you want.
Thank you, Rafael, and thank you for all being here today. Now, LiDAR is undoubtedly a powerful tool for archaeological anthropology, allowing for large-scale detailed relief mapping of ancient anthropogenic engineered landscapes, and it is a powerful tool to develop sustainable strategies toward the conservation of historical landscapes to best effect for both indigenous and national societies. Now, the vast plains of the Western Orinoco Basin, encompassing Colombia and Venezuela, are characterized by extensive savanna grasslands, covering over 420,000 square kilometers in Venezuela alone. Several large areas are interspersed with sand dunes dating from the late Pleistocene to early Holocene, and large parts are seasonally flooded between 3 and 5 months of the year. Now, south of the Guaviare River, the savanna gives way to a humid tropical rainforest plains with spotted outcrops of the Guyana Shield's Proterozoic rocks. Through the history of human occupation in the Venezuelan Llanos, societies have developed diverse, ingenious adaptations to the seasonal climatic rhythms of these grassland plains to maximize efficiency in the exploitation of its economic resources. Some of these activities have left their scars in the landscape, such as artificial mounds, ridges and ditches, causeways, agricultural fields, and drainage canals for water management. From the earliest known occupation attested by archaeology, dating to around 250 BC in the Venezuelan Llanos, both highly nomadic and settled sedentary lifeways have coexisted in the region and have developed symbiotic relationships of trade and economic interdependence. In some regions, like around Barinas, complex socio-political organizations developed during the Prehispanic times. However, considering the vastness of the area, archaeologists have studied only a minuscule set of points in this landscape. This is where LiDAR ought to fill in, and in detail, the vast gaps of knowledge of the scale and type of landscape transformations with implications for human societies, not just from the past, but also for the future. Now, first, we will comment on Falcón State, and then we'll give way to the Western Llanos. Now, Falcón State has recently showed new anthropogenic landscapes that were unknown before in the region called Fila Atravesada Mountain and along the La Guaraba River Valley in Falcón State, Venezuela, as you can see on the map. This range overlooks the Pedregal Valley bottom, best known for the very early Holocene Paleoamerican sites dating between 13,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago that belong to El Hobo tradition, with these unique projectile points that you can see. Much later occupations in the area, post-dating AD 800, are, for example, exemplified by the Guacoa ceramic complex, which may perhaps be related to the recently detected raised fields. Next slide. There, we have two of these anthropogenic landscape features. Now, site one is located on a basin-shaped mesa on top of the Fila Atravesada, and another site, number two, on an alluvial terrace along the Guarabita Creek. These and several others were detected earlier this year by my colleague Felipe Torrealba through Google Earth. The climate in this region is semi-arid, under 1,000 millimeters a year, and it is characterized by very dry tropical forest vegetation, including xerophytic species. Water management and resources are therefore particularly important. Traditional cultivation plots and house gardens through this region as of the 1980s, when I was there, depend on precipitation, although there are some artificially irrigated fields with typical straight line furrows with roughly rectangular plots. Next slide. What is distinct, for example, in this field 1 is the construction or excavation of a water reservoir or pond feeding into the cultivation field. Such artificial ponds alone are common in arid Falcón as water holes for goat herding. But this raised field consists of a complex geometric pattern of ridges and deep furrows that suggest more than just practical preparation for agriculture. This locus, on a small plateau, forms a basin that during the wet season floods and feeds into the pond, and feeds from the pond. It seems that the furrows or canals keep the cultivation ridges above the flood at high level stage, and as water progressively recedes, the canals are still being able to keep the ridges subsoil moist for cultivation. Because of the COVID pandemic, these and other similar sites have not been investigated on the ground yet, although it is my suspicion that these fields are not modern, perhaps dating to pre-Hispanic period and into the colonial period. During my years of research in the Pedregal Valley, I never witnessed a single traditional cultivation plot with such elaborate geometric features as shown here. So these are not unique in the region. We know of many others that still need to be investigated, and none have yet been investigated on the ground. Now, LiDAR documentation program would be essential not just to map these features, and undoubtedly many others still awaiting discovery, but also for designing conservation policies to a native system cultivation that appears to be no longer in use. Historical landscapes like this will in due course be altered, even erased by natural erosion processes and anthropogenic action. LiDAR will ensure their preservation for the future. Now, I will pass the presentation to the Western Llanos and my friend, Rafael Gasol.
Thank you very much, Jose. The Western Venezuelan Llanos consists largely of several types of savanna grasslands, which are temporarily flooded during the wet season. The seasonal climatic conditions has led to various kinds of adaptations by human groups. Thus far, the archaeological dates human presence to the beginning of the first millennium BC, but most of the sites in the Llanos begin at around the 3rd to 2nd century BC. The first archaeological sequence for the Barinas area, western half of the Apure, Barinas, and Portuguesa states, was proposed in 1958 by Jose Crucian and Irving Rouse. These pioneer archaeologists established two basic cultural complexes, Agua Blanca in the foothills of Portuguesa and Caño del Oso in the plains of Barinas. These correspond to period 2, 1050 BC to 350 AD, and period 4, 1150 to 1500 AD of the regional chronology. This initial sequence was later refined by Alberta Zucchi, at the right, who established two cultural complexes, Caño del Oso and La Betania, belonging to the Caño del Oso tradition. Later, in the 1970s, Zucchi, with the help of the cultural geographer William Denevan, investigated the origins and importance of the intensification of the pre-Hispanic agriculture in the Llanos of Venezuela. According to them, the ancient producers of the savannas used slash and burn, home gardens, and clean cultivation in savannas and floodplains. In addition, various earthen structures, including grain fields, raised fields, and canals, were used to cultivate the humid savannas. This project's attention was directed mainly to the study of agricultural systems, but soon to be refocused on questions on local and regional settlement patterns and its possible modes of social political organization and its supporting economies. In Barinas, Charles Spencer and Elsa Redmond indicate that complex societies or chiefdoms arose between 500 and 600 AD, based on several types of evidence. First, a hierarchy of three-level settlements. Second, monumental architecture. Third, increase in regional population. Fourth, differentiation in residential and funeral patterns. Five, development of complex technologies of intensive agriculture and transportation. And six, complex social relations with other sociopolitical units, including long-distance exchange and war. The political unit at the left had a territory joined by roads that connected three-tiered sites, a regional primary center, El Gabán, with a large site area of 30 square hectares, two large mounds, and a causeway encircling the site. The second tier was composed by sites with the smaller mounds, may have or may have not a connecting calzada. And the third tier, a total of 29 sites with no mounts, a small habitation area, and may or may not have a connecting causeway. And finally, two drained fields areas. This is a view of the regional center El Gabán from the air, showing the central area are the connecting calzadas. And these are the area of drain fields La Tigra connected to the main regional center by a causeway. This basic chiefdom polity model developed by Spencer and Redmond has been augmented and refined with subsequent investigation in the region of El Cedral. This area is about 25 kilometers southeast of El Gabán and 34 kilometers west to northwest of Hato La Calzada. This is a view of the general region of El Cedral when a general survey was made. This is a map of the El Cedral area showing the regional center and its connections by causeway to several other sites and areas. This is a comparison between the regional centers of El Gabán and Cedral. As I told you, the regional center of El Gabán is about 30 square hectares. Compare that with El Cedral, which is 90 square hectares. On the other hand, the road network is much longer. Several of the causeways have monumental characteristics. These multifunctional structures also serve as dams and irrigation systems, also serve for defense and surveillance, and facilitated mobilization of people to and from the agricultural fields. So they were not just, they were more than roads. The distribution of agricultural fields indicates that they were directly under the control of the regional center and were also much longer. The fields can be described as a series of dikes, channels, and locks that allowed the controlled irrigation of a series of spaces that surrounded the regional primary center, and that allowed the production of plants and possible fish and other animals. The analysis of resource catchments and production areas do not support the hypothesis that these fields were built in response to population growth. We have evidence that various cultivation systems were practiced in the region. with different degrees of archaeological visibility. These include home gardens, slash and burn agriculture, intensive agriculture, and lowland agriculture. We are interested in knowing how these combine and change over time, since we suspect that although they could work together, the intensity of use of each one could vary depending on the climatic and sociopolitical conditions. There is abundant data indicating that these ancient anthropogenic landscape agricultural systems were used far more extensively and intensively throughout the Llanos plains than previously believed. Their study in relation to settlement and subsistence economy systems, along with climate change, is one of the most exciting challenges that the archaeology of the Llanos faces in the future. Further, many are endangered features through both natural processes of erosion and sedimentation and by modern extensive agricultural techniques, including cattle ranching and other mechanized disturbances. Finally, through Google Earth satellite images, often of poor resolution, many other raised fields, causeways, and drained fields have been spotted throughout the Venezuelan and Colombian llanos. Yet, they still await research on the ground and undoubtedly are expected to be associated with the prehispanic settlements, as for example, this unnamed locality near the Arauca River. Now, I turn to my friend and colleague, Natalia Lozada Mendieta.
Thank you, Rafael and Jose, for having me here and inviting me to this panel. I'm going to refer to a very specific region on the Colombian border, and it's the Rio Tomo and Orinoco River conjuncture, the river juncture, sorry. And this area, it covers also region that it's protected by the Natural National Park of El Tuparro. The archaeological site that I think it's relevant for this discussion is the Pozo Azul site that you can see underlined with this blue line in the image. And Pozo Azul site is a site that it's about 30 square hectares. It was first recorded by Castaño and Soto in 1986, and it was recently inspected through a survey earlier this year by my research team. What we see in this site are terraces and mounds that are not very clear if they are artificial or natural. What we do know is that this area is prone to flooding, and so this basically raised areas are privileged in finding evidence associated to ancient human occupation. There seems to be a concentration of ceramic materials associated to these mounds and terraces in this part of the region. The Tomo River area that you see close to the river mouth has other archaeological sites that also present some ceramic material evidence in lithics. They're closer to the mouth and in both sides of the river channel. And in those sites, we do not see this sort of mounds and terraces concentrations that there are in Pozo Azul. But nonetheless, this area seems to have, the Pozo Azul area seems to have the highest concentration of material in this landscape. And so we think that here LiDAR will help us to identify and map this sort of type of landscape and mounds and terraces and elevated ground, and to better understand the occupation patterns in this place. Could you go to the next slide, please, Rafael? Thank you. So the Pozo Azul site, as you can see in this landscape view, it's also very, it covers a very big area. I already mentioned 30 square hectares, and it varies through different seasons. So the mounds are less visible in some of the seasons, of course, when the flooding, it's still there, they are less evident. But what we do see is that there seems to be also a type of landscape that it's associated with these mounds, and it's the palm grove or morichal that you can see there in the images. This sort of landscape is associated to human occupation in the area. And so to identify the distribution of this sort of structures and their relation to this other type of ecosystem would be also key to better comprehend how the human occupation, the ancient human occupation in this area occurred. Next slide, please, Rafael. Thank you. I'm just going to show you some of the ceramic and lithic scatter concentrations that we were able to find earlier this year associated to the mountain crest and the terraces. As you can see, they're very big potsherds, and it's very unlikely to find this sort of evidence in other archaeological sites in the area because of the same flooding that we have mentioned. It doesn't help with the conservation and the size of the potsherds, but nonetheless, in this area, they seem to be bigger and they seem to be more concentrated. The type of ceramics that we see are very different. They're varied. Some of them have fibers and borne tree bark, as the one that I'm showing in the pictures. Others have some very different recipes, and they can also be found on the other side of the river. But in this side, on the Venezuelan side, they do not follow the same occupation pattern with the terraces and the mounds. And so the LiDAR would be very interesting to help us comprehend the different sort of occupations in the whole area, not just on the Colombian side, and to see the logics of occupation that some of these groups followed in ancient times. Next slide, please, Rafael. Thank you. And of course, this is a natural park, a national natural park, the Tuparro. And as you can see in the picture, we had the help of some of the park rangers who are also indigenous people that work along with us in the recent survey that we conducted in the Pozo Azul area. They are also very keen to understand how to identify this sort of landscape and how to better protect this area. And so this mapping and the research that comes along with all of this effort would also be very helpful for national authorities and also, well, the National Natural Park to protect the heritage and help conserve this landscape. That leaves us with the conclusions. So as I mentioned before, LiDAR has very different applications in this area, and it would be fundamental for Venezuelan and Colombian Venezuelan archaeology in the border, because as you can see, we are very few specialists, very few and far apart to cover such a huge and still relatively unknown territory. And to have the help of this sort of system will help us better understand how to, well, prioritize the area and also how to better plan, because in a country that is facing problems related to climate emergency, decreased resources for research, illegal mining, LiDAR will be a great help to help us plan and conserve this landscape and to better allocate key resources. Finally, LiDAR technology will give us the opportunity, and also to farmers, indigenous people, scientific community, and the park community, the park rangers, to create and participate in joint research, conservation, and sustainable development projects carried on historical landscape and archaeological heritage. Thank you very much for joining us today in this talk. Thank you to my colleagues. Thanks, Jose. Thanks, Rafael.
I thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.